I still tell myself it was just the altitude, the exhaustion, the sweet metallic smell of blood mixed with pine. But I know what I felt that dawn. I felt the exact moment when the body stopped being a body and became an absence, a cold, empty space in the snow where something heavy had been. It all started 2 days before, when I agreed to guide a man into a part of the forest that swallows trails and secrets. The first time I saw Ernesto, he was nursing a cup of black coffee at a corner table in the Perkins, letting the steam trace patterns on his weathered face. It was 6 in the morning, the air outside still thick with the blue-gray haze of a Montana dawn in late autumn. The place smelled of burnt coffee and pancake syrup, a comforting, mundane scent that felt a world away from where we were headed. I'm a guide. I've spent 20 years taking people into the Gallatin National Forest. I've seen city folks who think a North Face jacket makes them invincible, and seasoned hunters who tremble at the first sound of a bull elk's bugle. You learn to read people fast. It's part of the job, maybe the most important part. Ernesto wasn't in any category I knew. He'd booked me for a 3-day scouting trip, a vague request that usually meant a wealthy enthusiast wanting to photograph wolves or track a trophy elk without the pressure of a full-on hunt. But Ernesto didn't look like a photographer. He wasn't fidgeting with a camera bag or talking about lenses. He wore a heavy, frayed wool coat that had seen more winters than I had, and his hands, wrapped around the ceramic mug, were thick and calloused, the knuckles scarred. He looked up as I approached, his eyes dark and patient. They were the eyes of a man who knew how to wait for things. "You are the guide?" he asked. His English was hard, the syllables chewed and formed deliberately, as if each word was a tool he was using for the first time. The accent was from somewhere deep in South America. Argentina, his booking email had said. "That's me," I said, extending a hand. "Good to meet you, Ernesto." His grip was firm, dry, and brief. He didn't smile, just gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Coffee?" "Already had my fill, thanks." I sat down, placing my worn topo map on the table between us. I started to unroll it, to go over the usual spiel. Routes, safety protocols, expected weather patterns. It's a ritual I perform with every client. That sets a professional tone, establishes that I'm the one in charge out there. He let me talk for a minute, his eyes fixed on the map, but not really seeing it. He was listening to my voice, not my words. When I paused to point out the valley we'd be entering, he finally spoke, cutting through my practiced monologue. "This place," he said, tapping a thick finger on the dark green cluster of contour lines that marked the southernmost finger of the forest. "It is quiet." "Quietest part of the range," I confirmed. "Most people stick to the northern trails. This section, it's remote. The terrain's rough, easy to get turned around if you don't know it. The trees grow so thick they seem to swallow any trail as soon as the wind changes." He nodded slowly, a deep, resonant sound in his chest. Then he smiled for the first time. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was a baring of teeth. They were large, white, and perfectly cared for, a stark, unsettling contrast to the rest of his rugged appearance. "Good," he said. "No tourists." I felt a prickle of unease. "What exactly are we scouting for, Ernesto? You weren't specific in your email." "Elk, bear." He took a slow sip of his coffee, his gaze never leaving mine. The diner's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a sound I'd never noticed before. He placed the mug down with a soft click. "In my country," he said, his voice dropping to a low conversational tone, as if discussing the weather, "we call them lobison." The word hung in the air, foreign and sharp. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew the sound of it. It was old. He saw the confusion on my face and clarified, his accent thickening. "Here you have another name, I think, werewolf, pero es lo mismo." "It is the same." I stared at him. I've had clients tell me ghost stories around a campfire, talk about Bigfoot sightings they heard from a cousin's friend. It's usually fueled by whiskey and the immensity of the night sky. But this was different. This was a statement of fact, delivered in the sterile light of a diner over lukewarm coffee. My first instinct was to laugh, to dismiss him as a crank. But the look in his eyes stopped me. There was no flicker of jest, no hint of madness. There was only a profound, weary certainty. He had shoulders built for carrying dead things, and I suddenly understood he wasn't talking about deer. "I have seen it," he added, his voice barely a whisper. "Before." I fell back on my training, When a client says something strange, you don't argue. You don't engage. You offer the silence of a professional guide and let them fill the void with whatever they need to. I simply nodded, folded the map and reviewed the protocol. Okay, well, out there the rules are simple. We maintain a clear line of sight at all times. No shots fired downhill ever, and the radio stays on, Channel 7. He seemed to appreciate the return to practicalities. He finished his coffee and stood up, leaving a few dollars on the table. As we walked out into the cold morning air, he went to his rental truck and pulled out a long, hard-sided case. He unlatched it, and the sound of the metal clasps popping open was sharp and final. Inside, nestled in custom-fit foam, was a bolt-action rifle, a classic .30-06. The woodstock was dark and oiled, the barrel a matte blue. He worked the bolt, and it slid home with a clean, crisp snap, a sound as pure and cold as ice breaking on a frozen lake. That's when I knew for sure. He hadn't come all the way from Argentina for an elk head to hang on his wall. He had come to kill something. And he believed with every fiber of his being that it wasn't human. The drive to the trailhead was mostly silent. Ernesto stared out the passenger window of my pickup, his gaze sweeping over the landscape with an intensity that made me feel like a tourist in my own backyard. I've driven this road 1,000 times. I know every curve, every pothole, every place a deer is likely to bolt into the road. To me, it was just the commute. To him, it was a pilgrimage into enemy territory. The pavement ended, and the truck rattled onto a gravel service road, the tires crunching over loose stones. The forest closed in around us, the tall lodgepole pines standing like silent sentinels on either side. My grandfather hunted here, I said, trying to break the heavy silence. His father, too. They said these woods have a memory. They hold on to things. Ernesto turned from the window, his dark eyes fixing on me. Memories are not the only things they hold. He said it simply, without drama, and then turned back to the passing trees. The conversation was over. We parked in a small empty lot at the end of the road. The air was thin and sharp, carrying the clean, resinous scent of pine and the damp, earthy smell of decaying leaves. It was cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and stays there. I pulled on my pack, the familiar way to comfort, and checked the straps. Ernesto moved with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice. He slung his rifle over his shoulder, the .30-06 looking like a natural extension of his body. We started up the trail, a narrow track that wound its way into a steep-sided valley. This was the kind of fold in the terrain that plays tricks with sound. It compresses it, muffles it, and sometimes it throws your own breath back at you, making it sound like there's something else keeping pace with you just out of sight. I was used to it, but I watched Ernesto. He wasn't fooled. His head was on a constant, slow swivel, his senses taking in everything. He had the observational stillness of a priest in a confessional, listening for the sins of the land. The day started to fade early. The sky, which had been a pale, washed-out blue, thickened into a uniform sheet of grey. The light grew flat and shadowless, making it hard to judge distances. The snow underfoot was old, a treacherous crust on the edges that gave way to soft, wet powder in the middle. Each step made a sucking sound as our boots sank in, leaving behind a perfect half-moon impression. I noticed Ernesto kept looking back at our tracks, his expression one of intense, almost affectionate concentration. It was as if he was reading a story in them that I couldn't see. "The snow is a good book," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "It tells you who has passed, and what they are hiding." We hiked for hours, climbing steadily. The valley narrowed, the pine and fir trees growing so dense they formed a dark, interlocking canopy overhead. The world became a tunnel of green, grey, and white. There were no birds, no squirrels chattering their alarms from the branches. The usual small noises of the forest were gone. All I could hear was the crunch of our boots, the rhythm of our breathing, and the soft rustle of our jackets. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. It was the silence of a place holding its breath. As the last of the weak afternoon light began to drain away, the wind changed. It shifted from the west to the north, a sudden cold blast that carried a new scent with it. It wasn't just pine and snow anymore. It was something else, something wet, rank, and vaguely musky. It was the smell of a large, unwashed animal. And then we heard it. It came from the ridge to our left, maybe half a mile away. It wasn't the long, mournful, rising and falling howl of a grey wolf. I've grown up with that sound. I can measure a wolf's age, its hunger, its distance just by the tone. This was wrong. It started as a low cough, a hacking sound from deep in a massive chest. Then it tore upwards into a short explosive cry that scraped the air like a jagged piece of metal. It didn't taper off. It just broke. It shattered and then died, leaving the trees to sway in the sudden ringing silence that followed. My hand went to the canister of bear spray on my hip, a purely instinctual reaction. My mind was racing through possibilities. A cougar with a throat injury, a diseased coyote, but my gut knew better. My gut knew that what we'd just heard didn't belong to any animal in my guidebook. I looked at Ernesto. He hadn't flinched. He was standing perfectly still, his head cocked slightly, listening to the echoes die among the trees. He met my gaze, and a flicker of something, not fear but grim acknowledgement, passed through his eyes. He gave a single slow nod, as if he'd just received a long-overdue confirmation. He spoke one word, his breath pluming in the frigid air. Hoy. Tonight, Ernesto's hoy hung between us, colder than the wind. There was no discussion. The strange broken howl had ended any pretense that this was a normal trip. We weren't scouting anymore. We were waiting. We found a small, relatively flat clearing, screened by a thick stand of firs, and began to make camp. My movements were automatic, honed by years of practice. Method is a comfort when your nerves are raw. I laid out the ground tarp, snapped the tent poles into place, and began staking the guy lines. No fire, Ernesto said. It wasn't a suggestion. It'll get down to single digits tonight, I argued, my voice tight. A small fire. A fire is a beacon, he interrupted, his eyes scanning the darkening woods around us. It says here we are. Tonight we do not want to say that. He was right. I hated that he was right. The thought of a long, fireless night in this cold, oppressive valley made my skin crawl. We settled for the small backpacking stove, its weak, vegan-friendly hiss a pathetic substitute for the crackle and roar of a real fire. We huddled in the small vestibule of the tent, boiling water for our dehydrated meals, the light fading around us as if an unseen hand were slowly turning down a dimmer switch on the entire world. I'm a creature of habit. Routine is safety. I arranged our camp with my usual precision. I created a windbreak on the eastern side with a line of fallen logs. The food bag was hung from a high branch a good 30 paces away, a standard precaution against bears. I placed our two-way radio on top of my foam sleeping pad inside the tent, set to the emergency VHF frequency. My own rifle, a liver-action 30-30, I carry more for noise than anything else, was laid unloaded but within arm's reach, a box of cartridges beside it. Ernesto broke my carefully constructed sense of order with a quiet, maddening ritual of his own. He sat cross-legged, his 30-06 disassembled across his lap on a small oilcloth. With meticulous care he cleaned and oiled each part, his movements fluid and economical. Then he reassembled it. The metallic tick-tick of the parts sliding together, the dry click of the bolt seating, the soft sigh as he tested the action. The sounds were small, but in the profound silence, they were as loud as gunshots. He did it 3 times, not out of necessity, but as if he were trying to remind his hands, his muscles, his very soul, what they were there to do. It was a catechism of steel and wood. When we finally finished our meal and killed the stove, the darkness became absolute. It wasn't just an absence of light. It felt like a physical presence. It had weight and texture. It pressed in on the thin nylon walls of the tent, and I felt a strange constriction in my chest, as if I had to work harder just to draw a breath. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, the synthetic material rustling loudly, and lay on my back staring up at a ceiling I couldn't see. Sleep didn't come. It was replaced by a state of hyper-awareness. Every tiny sound from the forest was amplified. The whisper of the wind through the pine needles, the groan of a tree branch shifting under its own weight, the soft thump of a clump of snow falling from a bough. I tried to catalogue them, to assign them a rational source, to put them in their proper place. Then came the sounds that didn't belong. It started with footsteps. They were heavy but careful. They weren't the 4-footed rhythm of a deer or elk, nor the lumbering shuffle of a bear. It was a bipedal gait, but it was wrong. Thump, 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 a pause. Then thump, thump, another long pause. It was moving with a limping, exploratory cadence, testing the ground. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. I could hear Ernesto's breathing beside me, slow and controlled through his nose. He was awake. He was listening. The steps grew closer, circling our position. Then came a new sound, the sharp cracking noise of the frozen snow crust being broken by something heavy. It was deliberate. It was moving onto the packed snow of our clearing, moving toward the tent. I held my breath, my muscles tense to the point of pain. The sound stopped just outside. The silence stretched thin and taut. And then came the noise that sometimes, even now, wakes me up in a cold sweat. It was the sound of a large, thick fingernail being dragged slowly across the taut nylon of the tent wall. Zip. A long, coarse scraping, no more than 2 feet from my head. It wasn't an attack. It wasn't trying to get in. It felt inquisitive. It drew a line, paused, and then drew another one below it. It was like someone absently doodling on a piece of paper, marking their territory, leaving a note. My body was seized by a primal, paralyzing fear. It was more than just a scare. It was a fundamental violation. This thin wall of fabric was the only thing separating me from that. And the thing on the other side knew it. It knew we were in here, helpless and listening. The air inside the tent grew thick, and a new smell reached me, seeping through the breathable fabric. It was a foul, sour odor, the rank smell of a human body that has sweated hard and let the sweat dry, mingled with a stronger metallic stench, like old rust, that I knew was coming from its breath. Ernesto's voice was a ghost of a whisper, right next to my ear. He had shifted, his Spanish now intimate and urgent, the accent of a man speaking from his deepest roots. "No, Maya," he breathed. "A él le gusta eso. Don't look." "He likes that." I had no intention of looking. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for it to go away. The scraping stopped. There was a long, deep snuffling sound, an inhalation that seemed to draw all the warmth out of the tent. Then, with the same unhurried deliberation, the footsteps resumed, moving away, growing fainter and fainter until they were swallowed once more by the immense, waiting silence of the forest. The guest had left our door. The creature was gone, but its presence lingered. It was in the foul scent that clung to the air inside the tent, a greasy, organic smell that made my stomach turn. It was in the deafening silence that rushed in to fill the void its footsteps had left behind. That silence was worse than the noise. It felt charged, watchful. My entire body was a single, rigid knot of terror. I lay perfectly still, my ears straining, listening for the slightest hint of its return. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. Every creak of a branch sounded like a claw scraping on bark. Beside me, Ernesto's breathing remained unnervingly steady. He was a man made of iron and prayer. How could he be so calm? Or maybe it wasn't calm. Maybe it was something else, a resignation so profound it looked like peace. He had come here expecting this. He had come here for this. I was just the hired help who'd stumbled into someone else's nightmare. "Is it gone?" I finally managed to whisper, my voice a dry, cracking thing. "For now," he replied, his voice still low. "It knows we are here. It has our scent. It was a greeting." A greeting. The word was so absurd, so hideously inadequate for what had just happened, that I almost choked. A greeting from what? What kind of thing announces itself by drawing on your tent with its claws in the middle of a frozen, God-forsaken night? I wanted to scream questions at him. What is it? Why is it here? What do you know? But the fear had a physical grip on my throat. The words wouldn't come out. I fumbled in the dark for my headlamp, my fingers clumsy and shaking. I needed light. I needed to banish the oppressive, absolute blackness that felt like a shroud. "No!" Ernesto's hand shot out and clamped down on my wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. "No lights. It will draw it back. Its eyes, they see the light. They are drawn to it." I froze, his words painting a horrifying picture in my mind. 2 luminous, predatory eyes staring out of the darkness, fixed on our fragile shelter. I let my hand fall away from the lamp. We were plunged back into the sensory deprivation of the dark, with nothing but the sound of our own breathing and the frantic beating of my heart. The hours that followed were the longest of my life. Sleep was an impossible luxury. My mind was a carousel of horrors, replaying the scraping sound, imagining the shape and size of the hand that made it. I tried to rationalize. A porcupine? No, the sound was too deliberate. A bear. A bear would have been more direct, more destructive. It would have torn the tent to shreds looking for food. This was different. This was intelligent. It was curious. And that was the most terrifying part of all. It wasn't just a beast acting on instinct. It was thinking. I focused on the smell. As a guide, you learn to trust your nose. It can warn you of a rutting bull elk, a nearby predator, a change in the weather. The scent that had filled our tent was complex and deeply unsettling. The base note was that sour, unwashed body odor, something I'd smelled on homeless people in the city, a scent of human neglect. But layered on top of that was the coppery, metallic smell of old blood, and beneath it all a faint, sharp tang of ammonia, like the urine of a large carnivore. It was a monstrous paradox, the scent of man and beast twisted together into one unholy perfume. I must have drifted into a state of exhausted stupor at some point, because I was startled back to full heart-pounding awareness by a soft sound from Ernesto. He was murmuring, his voice a low rhythmic cadence. It took me a moment to realize he was praying in Spanish. I couldn't make out the words, just the soft sibilance of the language, a river of ancient syllables flowing into the darkness. He wasn't praying for deliverance. His tone wasn't desperate. It was resolute, like a soldier reciting an oath before battle. He was preparing himself. The first hint of dawn was not a light, but a change in the quality of the darkness. The absolute black softened to a deep charcoal gray. The stark outlines of the nearby trees began to emerge from the gloom like ghosts. The temperature dropped to its lowest point, a biting, painful cold that found every gap in my clothing. The world outside the tent was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was the empty, clean silence of a new day, not the charged, waiting silence of the night. We lay there without speaking for what felt like an eternity, listening. Finally, Ernesto shifted. "It is gone," he said, and this time his voice held a note of finality. "The sun is its enemy." He unzipped the tent flap with a single decisive motion. The cold grey light flooded in, stark and unforgiving. It felt like being born into a new, harsher world. I followed him out, my body stiff and sore, my nerves frayed to the breaking point. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe, and there in the fresh, unmarked snow of our campsite was the evidence of our nocturnal visitor. And it was worse than I could have imagined. The morning air was a blade in my lungs. I stood stiffly beside the tent, my eyes scanning the small clearing, trying to reconcile the placid, snow-covered scene with the primal terror of the night. My gaze fell first on the tent wall. There they were, 4 long parallel lines, drawn with surgical precision into the frost that coated the nylon. They weren't deep enough to tear the fabric, but they were etched there, a clear and deliberate message. I ran my gloved finger over one. The frost crumbled away, revealing the faint scored line beneath. Ernesto wasn't looking at the tent. His attention was fixed on a spot in the snow about 10 paces away, near the edge of the tree line. He walked toward it slowly, his rifle held at a low ready. I followed, my own .30-30 feeling like a child's toy in my hands. It was a depression in the snow, roughly the size of a large man. But it wasn't the shape of a man. It was longer, narrower, and the impression was deepest at what would have been the torso. This was where it had lain down, where it had watched us. The snow inside the hollow wasn't white and crystalline like the surrounding surface. It had a strange, greasy quality, a sort of oily, iridescent sheen that caught the flat morning light in disturbing rainbow swirls, like oil on a puddle of water. It looked as though the creature's body heat had been so intense it had melted the top layer of snow, which had then refrozen into a thin, smooth skin of ice. "Look," Ernesto said, his voice a low rumble. He pointed with the barrel of his rifle. Embedded in the icy sheen were hairs. They were nothing like the soft, dense fur of a bear or the finer hair of a wolf or coyote. These were thick, coarse, and black as charcoal. Some were over 6 inches long, wiry and stiff like bristles from a brush. A few of them had strange pale tips, almost like the keratin of a fingernail, as if the cuticle itself extended far beyond the root. The smell from the night lingered here, trapped in the frozen depression, sour sweat and old blood. Now, with a stronger note of ammonia, I knelt down, my rational mind desperately searching for a mundane explanation. A sick animal? A bear with mange? But no bear I'd ever seen or tracked had hair like this. No animal I knew of left an oily residue on the snow. My mind was a closed door, and reality was on the other side, pounding, demanding to be let in. Ernesto reached into his coat and pulled out a small, worn wooden rosary. He held it tightly in his gloved hand, his lips moving in a silent prayer. He then knelt opposite me, his eyes filled with a kind of grim sorrow, and made the sign of the cross over the unholy indentation in the snow. He wasn't doing it to ward off evil. It felt more like a rite of pity, an acknowledgement of a cursed and fallen thing. Watching him, a devout man performing a sacred ritual over the resting place of a monster, was profoundly unsettling. It lent the moment a weight, a reality that I could no longer deny. This was not a story. This was not a myth. This was real. "We should go," I said, my voice hoarse. "Pack up. Get back to the truck. We can report." "Report what?" Ernesto interrupted, his gaze still fixed on the snow. "That we were visited by a ghost? That we found strange hair? They will say it was a bear. They will laugh. They will send a young ranger who will find nothing. No, the report has been made." He tapped his chest. "Here." He was right. What could I possibly say to the sheriff or the Forest Service that wouldn't get me labeled as crazy? Something scratched my tent and it smelled bad. I felt a surge of helpless anger. The rules of my world, the world of evidence and logic, did not apply here. Acting on an impulse I didn't understand, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small plastic evidence bag I carry in my first aid kit for collecting plant samples. With the tip of my knife, I carefully pried a few of the coarse black hairs from the ice. They were stiff and brittle. I sealed them in the bag and tucked it deep into an inner pocket of my jacket. A piece of a nightmare captured and contained. It felt both foolish and necessary. Proof for myself that I hadn't imagined it. Ernesto watched me without comment. When I was done, he stood up and kicked a spray of fresh snow over the depression, obscuring the oily sheen and the remaining hairs. It was an act of burial, of concealment. "We do not go back," he said, shouldering his rifle. "We go forward. We find its trail. Today it will be careless. It is hungry. It has spent the night playing games. Now it must hunt." His words sent a fresh chill down my spine. The thought of deliberately tracking the thing that had terrorized us all night was insane. My every instinct screamed at me to retreat, to get back to the safety of my truck and the civilized world. But I looked at Ernesto's face, at the cold, resolute set of his jaw, and I knew there was no arguing. I had agreed to be his guide, and his path, I now understood, led directly into the heart of the darkness we had just survived. He turned and looked at me, and his expression held no triumph. "So I told you so." It was a look of shared burden, a quiet, devastating question that needed no words. "Do you believe me now?" I didn't answer. I just nodded, my throat too tight to speak, and went to start breaking down the tent. My hands were shaking. Packing up the camp was a tense, hurried affair. Every snap of a tent pole, every rustle of a sleeping bag, sounded like an alarm bell in the unnaturally quiet forest. The silence of the previous day had returned, but now it felt different. It was no longer a passive, heavy presence. It felt active, malevolent. It was the silence of a predator waiting in ambush. The woods were holding their breath, and I felt like we were the mice caught in the open field. Ernesto found the trail almost immediately. It led away from the back of our clearing, plunging deeper into the valley. He pointed, and I saw them, a series of deep, roundish prints in the snow. At first glance, they could have been from a large man in soft-soled boots. But as I knelt for a closer look, the wrongness of them became starkly, terrifyingly clear. A human walking in snow this deep puts pressure on the heel and then rolls forward. These prints were the opposite. The deepest part of the impression was at the front, on the ball of what would be the foot and the toes. The heel mark was shallow, almost non-existent. It was walking on the balls of its feet, like a sprinter or a dancer, a gait that would be incredibly difficult and unnatural for a human to maintain for any distance in this terrain. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the toes. Where the snow was compressed and firm, I could see their outline. There were 5 of them, but they were too long. Far too long. They were slender, almost like fingers, and they were splayed wide, gripping the snow. I traced the edge of one print with my gloved finger. It was easily a foot long. "Deformity," I muttered, the word sounding hollow and weak even to my own ears. Could be someone with a birth defect or severe frostbite lost their heels. My voice trailed off. I was grasping at straws, trying to weave a net of logic big enough to catch this monster and drag it back into the world I understood. Ernesto just shook his head, his expression patient, as if he were dealing with a child who refused to see the obvious. He pointed to another track a few feet ahead, one that was even clearer, preserved in a patch of wind-scoured, hard-packed snow. "Look closer," he said. I crawled forward and leaned down until my face was inches from the print. And then I saw it, pressed into the granular frozen surface, following the contour of what would be the arch and the top of the foot, with a faint but unmistakable impressions of hair. Not just a few stray strands like the ones we'd found in its bedding, but the distinct pattern of a sparse coat of fur covering the foot. My last shred of denial crumbled. It turned to dust and blew away on the cold north wind. No man, no matter how deformed or desperate, runs barefoot through the frozen Montana wilderness. No man has fur on his feet. My brain felt like it had short-circuited. Every survival instinct, every ounce of common sense I possessed was screaming at me to run, but I couldn't. I was mesmerized by the sheer impossibility of the tracks. They were a violation of nature, an affront to biology. "We follow," Ernesto stated, his tone leaving no room for debate. He was no longer my client. He was the commander of this insane expedition, and I was his reluctant soldier. We started to move, following the deliberate, unnerving trail. The creature wasn't trying to hide its path. If anything, it seemed to be leaving a deliberate breadcrumb trail for us to follow. The tracks led us away from the faint whisper of the game trail we had been on and into the deeper, untracked wilderness. The trees grew closer together, their lower branches heavy with snow, forcing us to duck and weave. The world became a claustrophobic maze of black trunks and white ground. After about an hour, I began to notice a strange pattern. The tracks were leading us from one small natural clearing to the next. We'd pushed through a dense thicket of pines, and just as the claustrophobia was becoming unbearable, the trees would open up into a small, sun-dappled meadow. We'd cross the meadow and the tracks would lead us into another dense patch of woods, which would, in turn, open up into another clearing. It was too perfect. It was too easy. "It's leading us," I said, my voice low and tense. "This isn't a random path. It's a route." "Yes," Ernesto agreed, his eyes scanning the perimeter of the clearing we were in. "It is a trap, or an invitation." "What's the difference?" I shot back, my fear curdling into anger. "A trap is for an animal," he said, his gaze sweeping the high ridges that flanked the valley. "An invitation is for an equal." The implication sent a fresh wave of cold through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. The creature wasn't just intelligent, it was arrogant. It was toying with us. It was drawing us deeper into its territory, onto its own terms, into a place of its own choosing. The sense of being prey was overwhelming. Every shadow seemed to move. Every snow-laden branch looked like a hunched shoulder. I felt 1,000 unseen eyes on my back. We were walking willingly into the jaws of something ancient and malevolent, and the only thing I could do was put one foot in front of the other and follow the Argentinian, who seemed to know the steps to this deadly dance. The feeling of being herded grew stronger with every clearing we crossed. It was a masterful piece of psychological warfare. The dense thickets of forest felt suffocating, making the open spaces of the meadows seem like a relief, a place to breathe. But I knew they were the opposite. In the clearings we were exposed, visible from the high tree-lined ridges on either side of the valley. We were walking onto a stage, and I had no doubt the audience was watching. I kept glancing up at the ridges, scanning the dark lines of trees for any sign of movement, any shape that was out of place. I saw nothing, but the feeling of being observed was a physical pressure against my skin. It was the same feeling you get when you're alone in your house at night and you hear a floorboard creak upstairs. You know with a certainty that bypasses all logic that you are not alone. Ernesto seemed to feel it too. He moved with a new kind of tension, his rifle held across his chest now, his thumb resting near the safety. His slow, sweeping scans of the terrain were gone, replaced by sharp, jerky movements of his head as he tried to pinpoint the source of our unease. "It has friends," he said, not looking at me. "Or family. One does not live so long alone. The thought of more than one of these things was something my mind simply couldn't handle. I pushed it away, focusing on the immediate. The snow, the trees, the man in front of me. I unclipped the radio from my belt. "I'm going to try calling in," I said, my voice a low murmur. "Just to check in. Let them know our position." "They will not answer," Ernesto said flatly. "How do you know?" "Because he is listening." He tapped his ear. "The air belongs to him here." Ignoring him, I pressed the push-to-talk button. "Base camp, this is Guide 1 radio check, over." The only response was a crackle of static. That wasn't unusual in these deep valleys, but then through the static I heard it. A soft but distinct click. It was the sound another radio makes when its user releases the transmit button. It was a phantom click, an electronic ghost. I tried again. "Base camp, Guide 1, do you copy?" Static. And then again, click. Someone was out there. Someone was on our frequency, listening, and had just keyed their mic, either by accident or as a deliberate, silent acknowledgement. My blood ran cold. Was it another hunter, a ranger, or was it the creature itself, somehow intelligent enough to operate a stolen radio? The thought was so bizarre, so completely outside the realm of possibility, that it felt more plausible than any other explanation. I clipped the radio back onto my belt, my hand shaking slightly. Ernesto gave me a knowing look. You see? The dynamic between us had completely shifted. In the diner, I was the professional, the expert in charge. He was the strange client. Now out here, our roles were reversed. This was his world, governed by his rules. The topo maps and safety protocols I relied on were useless. He was the one who understood the terrain of myth and nightmare. I was just a tourist, hopelessly lost. We continued on, following the tracks deeper into the valley, deeper into the trap. The sun was beginning its slow descent behind the western ridge, painting the undersides of the grey clouds in bruised shades of purple and orange. The temperature was dropping fast. We needed to find a place to make a stand, a defensible position for the night. But the tracks kept leading us onward, through another thicket toward one last large clearing. And then the smell hit us. It was the first warning, carried on the frigid breeze. It was thick, visceral, and unmistakable, the hot, coppery stench of fresh blood and the sour, acidic smell of a ruptured stomach. And beneath it all, that same foul, personal odor from the night before, the rank smell of the creature itself, but 100 times stronger. It was the smell of the slaughterhouse. Ernesto stopped dead, raising a hand to halt me. He closed his eyes and tilted his head, tasting the air like a predator. I stood frozen behind him, my rifle clutched in my hands. Through the last screen of fir trees I could see the clearing ahead, and I could see movement. Something dark was hunched over something pale in the snow. Ernesto slowly, silently lowered himself to one knee. His movements were liquid, practiced, utterly without wasted motion. He was a man who had done this before. He brought the rifle to his shoulder, the wooden stock settling into the curve of his body as if it had grown there. He was no longer just a man with a gun. He had become a weapon, and he was aimed at the heart of the darkness that awaited us in the clearing. The world seemed to shrink, focusing down to the narrow gap between two pine trees through which I could see the clearing. My breath caught in my chest, a painful, frozen lump. Everything was cast in the fading, ethereal light of dusk, a world of blue snow and black silhouettes. The shape was about 70 yards away, its form indistinct, a smudge of darkness against the white. It was hunched over the carcass of a doe. I could see that now. The deer's body was a pale, broken shape, its legs splayed at unnatural angles. The dark figure was bent low over it, its shoulders working, its head moving in a series of sickeningly fast, jerky motions. It was feeding. The sounds that reached us were quiet, but carried with horrifying clarity on the cold air. A wet, tearing sound, followed by a low, guttural gulping. It was the sound of pure, unrestrained hunger. My mind, in a desperate act of self-preservation, tried to make it a bear. It's a bear, I told myself. A black bear roused from hibernation, starving. But the shape was wrong. The shoulders were too narrow, the limbs too long and slender. It was built with a horrifying, lanky grace that no bear possessed. And the way its head moved, it would tear at the carcass with a frantic energy, then stop, lifting its head to look around, its movements decelerating as if it were a clockwork toy winding down, before snapping back to its meal with renewed ferocity. I was paralyzed, a spectator to a scene from a forgotten pagan world. This was not an animal hunting for survival. This was a desecration. The air was thick with the stench of blood and bile, a primordial soup of odors that bypassed thought and spoke directly to the oldest, most reptilian part of my brain, the part that only knows one word: flee. But Ernesto was a rock. He was absolutely still, a statue carved from ice and vengeance. He was fused with his rifle, his cheek pressed against the cold wood of the stock, his left hand cradling the forestock. So I watched the small white puff of his breath as he exhaled, a slow, controlled stream of vapor. He was mastering his body, slowing his heart rate, preparing for the single perfect moment. He didn't ask for my permission. He didn't give me a warning. He was an instrument of purpose, and the time for that purpose had come. He took one final slow breath, and I saw his finger, a dark shape against the silver of the trigger guard, begin to tighten. Time seemed to stretch and warp. The forest held its breath. The wet, tearing sounds from the clearing stopped. The figure lifted its head slowly, as if it had sensed the shift in the air, the focusing of lethal intent. For a split second, there was absolute silence, a perfect crystalline silence that felt as if it could last for an eternity. It was the silence between the lightning and the thunder. It was the silence of the grave. Then Ernesto's finger completed its journey. The crack of the 3006 was not a boom. It was a physical tearing of the air, a sharp, violent crack that slammed against the trees and echoed back from the ridges, a sound that felt like it had broken the world. In the fraction of a second that followed, I understood that there are noises our world is not meant to contain. The bullet struck home. I heard the unmistakable wet thump of a heavy caliber round hitting flesh and bone. The impact was immense. It didn't just knock the creature down, it spun it, throwing it sideways with brutal force. And in that half-turn, in that single horrifying moment before it collapsed, I saw it. It wasn't a full view. It was a profile, a nightmarish silhouette against the snow. And it will be burned into my memory until the day I die. It turned its head toward the sound of the shot, toward us. The head was vaguely human but elongated. The snout shorter than a wolf's but more pronounced than a man's. A long, matted mane of the same coarse black hair we'd found in the snow ran down its neck and back. An ear high on its head was long and sharply pointed like a bat's, but it was the eye in the mouth that broke my sanity. Its eye, just one, caught the beam of my headlamp, which I'd switched on in a panicked reflex. It didn't shine back green like a deer or a cat. It flared with a brilliant hellish orange, a soulless reflective disc, and the mouth, oh God, the mouth. As it was thrown by the bullet's impact, its jaw fell open in a silent snarl, and it just kept opening. It unhinged to a degree that was anatomically impossible for any creature I knew, human or animal. It was a gaping black maw lined with teeth that were too long, too sharp, too numerous. I heard, or maybe I just felt, a dry, chattering clatter as its own teeth smashed together from the shock of the impact. Then it was over. The creature collapsed onto its side in the snow like a discarded puppet, its limbs flopping bonelessly. It hit the ground with the sound of a heavy sack of broken sticks. A profound ringing silence descended upon the clearing. It was deeper than before, a vacuum left by the violence of the gunshot. The echo died, leaving nothing but the sound of my own blood roaring in my ears. Steam, or maybe smoke, rose from the dark, ragged wound in its side. More steam plumed from its open mouth, each cloud a little weaker than the last. We stayed where we were for a long time. Neither of us moved. Neither of us breathed. We were waiting for a twitch, a groan, any sign of life. There was nothing. The thing lay still, a heap of black fur and wrong angles on the pristine snow. Finally, Ernesto worked the bolt on his rifle, the shuck click of him ejecting the spent casing and chambering a new round shockingly loud in the stillness. He stood up slowly. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice raspy. He started walking toward the body, his steps slow and deliberate, the rifle held at his shoulder, ready. I couldn't stay put. My legs, acting on their own, carried me forward, a few paces behind him. I kept my own rifle raised, my heart hammering a frantic, panicked rhythm against my ribs. We approached the body like it was an unexploded bomb. The smell was overpowering now, the raw iron of blood, the stench of its fur, and a new acrid smell from the wound. We stopped about 10 feet away. It was sprawled on its side, facing away from us. I couldn't see its face, and I was deeply, profoundly grateful for that. What I could see was bad enough. A long, powerful leg, bent at a knee that seemed to be in the wrong place. A torso that was lean and corded with muscle under the patchy, coarse fur. And a hand. It was lying palm up in the snow. It was a hand, not a paw. It had 5 long, slender fingers, tipped with thick yellowed nails that were more like claws. It was too human to be an animal's and too animal to be a man's. The blood pumping from the hole in its chest was a dark, almost black, crimson. It steamed in the cold, melting the snow around it into a pinkish slurry. Ernesto lowered his rifle and nudged the creature's shoulder with the barrel, trying to roll it over. It was heavier than it looked. It shifted with a dead, solid weight. It was enough. The head lolled back, and for a sickening instant I saw part of the jawline, the wide, powerful mandible, the coarse hair growing high on the cheekbones. My stomach heaved. I turned away, gagging, fighting back the urge to vomit. My head was spinning. This was impossible. This couldn't be real. And then the forest spoke. From the dark wall of trees to our right, a sound erupted. It was a short, deep, guttural bark. It wasn't the sound of a dog or a coyote. It was a chesty, powerful sound, a sound of command and rage. Before the echo could even fade, another one answered it, from the opposite side of the clearing, from our flank. We were caught in a pincer. We were standing in the open, over the body of their dead, and we were not alone. The second bark acted like a cattle prod to my frozen nervous system. The spell of horrified fascination was broken, replaced by a surge of pure adrenalized panic. My head snapped up and I scanned the tree line, my rifle swinging wildly. The woods that had been a silent, watching entity were now an active, breathing threat. I could feel them, plural, in the darkness, watching us. Closing in. "We have to go," I hissed, my voice cracking. "Now." Ernesto didn't need convincing. He took one last look at the corpse, a look of grim, unfinished business, and then backed away, his rifle sweeping the dark perimeter of the clearing. "No," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "We cannot leave it. They will take it. There will be no proof." "Proof?" I almost screamed the word. "Who the hell are we going to prove it to, Ernesto?" "We'll be dead." A third bark, closer this time, ripped through the air from behind us, from the direction we had come. They were all around us. They had let us walk into the clearing, let us take the shot. They had been waiting. It had been a trap, and the corpse was the bait. The cold logic of a seasoned guide, the part of my brain trained for emergencies, finally kicked in, cutting through the terror. We couldn't carry it. The thing was massive, easily over 200 pounds, and we would be slow, easy targets. Leaving it was our only option. But we couldn't just run. We had to be smart. "Mark it," I said, my words coming in sharp, clipped bursts. "We mark the spot. We get out. We come back with help." It was a lie, and I think we both knew it. There was no help to come back with. But it was a plan. It was something to do other than stand here and wait to be torn apart. Ernesto nodded, his mind now focused on the tactical reality. While he kept watch, his rifle pointed toward the most recent bark, I scrambled for a way to mark the unholy ground. I tore a strip of red flagging tape from my pack. I always carry it for marking trails, and tied it securely to the branch of a low-hanging fir tree right above the body. The bright red was a garish slash against the blue-white of the snow. "The tree," Ernesto grunted, not taking his eyes off the woods. I understood. I pulled out my hunting knife, its blade gleaming in the gloom, and carved a large, crude X into the trunk of the same fir tree. The knife bit deep into the bark, leaving a pale, raw scar. A tombstone for a monster. "The radio is useless," I said, thinking aloud. "We need a beacon." My eyes landed on my high-powered flashlight. An idea, born of desperation, sparked in my mind. I switched it to its SOS strobe function. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short flashes. I wedged it into a fork in a branch, aiming the powerful beam straight up into the darkening sky. It was a long shot. A message in a bottle thrown into an ocean of wilderness, but it was better than nothing. Flash, flash, flash. Flash, flash, flash. Flash, flash, flash. The pulsing light cut a frantic, rhythmic path through the falling snow, a silent scream for help. "Done," I said, my breath fogging in front of my face. "Let's go." We move in a broken line. Don't give them a straight path to follow. We began our retreat, moving backward at first, facing the clearing, facing the corpse that lay under the pulsing strobe light. The barks had stopped. The silence had returned, and it was 100 times more terrifying. It was the silence of a coordinated hunt, of predators who no longer needed to communicate. Once we were back in the cover of the trees, we turned and began to run. Not a blind, panicked sprint, but a controlled ground-eating trot. We zigzagged, cutting through thickets, using the terrain to our advantage, trying to break our trail. Every snap of a twig behind us, every shadow that moved at the edge of my vision was another one of them. I could feel them pacing us, flanking us, staying just out of the light of our headlamps. I risked a glance back over my shoulder. Through a gap in the trees, I could still see the clearing. I could see the red flag. I could see the pulsing SOS light, and I saw something else, a dark shape, then another, slinking out from the tree line and approaching the body of their fallen comrade. And then I heard a sound that made my blood freeze solid in my veins. It was the sound of something heavy, something inert being dragged through the snow, a scraping, shuffling sound. The sound stopped the exact moment I looked. The shapes froze, and I knew they had seen me looking. They knew I had witnessed them. I didn't look back again. The retreat to our campsite was a blur of ragged breathing and heart-pounding fear. The 1.5-hour hike-in had become an agonizing, seemingly endless journey back. The forest was no longer a neutral space. Every tree was a potential hiding place, every shadow a threat. We didn't speak. The only sounds were the crunch of our boots on the snow and the frantic thumping of my own heart. The feeling of being followed, of being paced by silent, shadowy figures never left us. It was a constant prickling pressure on the back of my neck. We stumbled back into our small clearing to find the tent exactly as we'd left it, a sad, collapsed shape in the snow. It looked like a dead thing. There was no discussion of sleep. We built a massive bonfire, protocol be damned. We needed the light. We needed the heat. We needed the defiant, crackling roar of the flames to push back the oppressive, listening darkness. We spent the night sitting back to back, rifles across our laps, feeding the fire and staring out into the blackness beyond its flickering orange glow. I saw the flash of eyes twice. Low to the ground, a pair of brilliant orange points that reflected the firelight for a brief second before vanishing. They were far off at the edge of the clearing, just watching. They made no sound. They made no move to approach. They were simply letting us know they were there, that we were on their land under their watch. Sleep, when it finally came in the wee hours of the morning, was not a rest, but a surrender to utter physical and mental exhaustion. It was a shallow, dreamless state, punctuated by the crackle of the fire and the imagined sound of footsteps in the snow. Dawn arrived with a thick, wet fog that clung to the ground, reducing visibility to less than 20 feet. The world was a muffled grey void. The fog felt like a final insult from the forest, a deliberate act of concealment. "We go back," Ernesto said, his face grim and smudged with soot in the grey morning light. "Now, before the snow or the fog hides everything." I didn't want to go back. I wanted to pack our gear and hike down that mountain until my legs gave out. But I knew I had to. I had to see it one more time. I had to confront the impossible reality of it in the cold light of day. The fog made the journey back to the clearing even more disorienting. We navigated by compass and by memory, moving through a silent, ghostly world. As we drew closer, I could see a faint rhythmic pulsing in the mist ahead. The SOS beacon was still working. We broke through the last line of trees and stepped into the clearing, and my heart sank. Everything was exactly as we had left it. The red flagging tape hung limply from the fir branch, a bloody splash of color in the grey air. The X I had carved into the trunk was a pale, weeping wound on the tree. The flashlight, its batteries now dying, cast a weak, pathetic pulse of light into the fog. The blood was still there, a frozen, blackened crust on the snow, cracked and brittle like shattered obsidian. Everything was there, except for what mattered. The body was gone. In its place was a hollow, a perfectly preserved, body-shaped depression in the snow. It was an absence, a void, a cold and empty space that screamed louder than any corpse ever could. I walked forward, my boots crunching on the frozen ground, and stood at the edge of the hollow. I looked for drag marks. There were none. The snow around the depression was pristine, untouched, except for our own tracks from the night before. I looked for new footprints, the prints of the other creatures who had come to claim their dead. There were none. It was as if the body had been lifted straight up into the sky, as if it had simply evaporated. The smell had changed too. The coppery scent of blood was faint, locked in the ice, but overlaying it was that sharp ammoniac smell, stronger now, like the scent marker of a huge predator. And yet, paradoxically, the air also felt cleaner, as if the place had been scoured, washed by an invisible hand. "It's gone," I said, the words feeling stupid and small. "How?" Ernesto walked to the edge of the hollow and stared down into it, his face a mask of weary resignation. He looked like a man who had seen this exact scene play out many times before. "No queden," he said softly in Spanish. "They do not remain." A sudden hot rage boiled up inside me, displacing the fear. It was a rage against the impossibility of it all, against the quiet, maddening acceptance in Ernesto's eyes. "What does that mean? They do not remain?" I shouted, my voice raw, echoing in the foggy clearing. "Somebody took it. Something dragged it away. There has to be a sign." "A track!" I pointed a shaking finger at the empty space, at the undisturbed snow. "This doesn't just happen." Ernesto looked up from the hollow and met my gaze. There was no anger in his eyes, only a deep, profound sadness. He nodded once, a slow, tired motion. "Siempre," he whispered, his voice full of the weight of ages. "Always." The descent from the mountain was a silent, joyless march. The fog began to burn off as we lost altitude, but the grey, oppressive mood clung to us. We didn't look back. There was nothing to see but an empty space in the snow, and a series of questions that had no answers. My anger had evaporated, leaving behind a cold, heavy residue of defeat. The forest had won. It had taken our violence, our proof, and had simply erased it, leaving us with nothing but a story that no one would ever believe. We reached the truck in the late afternoon. It sat alone in the empty parking lot, a reassuringly solid piece of civilization. But as I got closer, I saw something that made the hair on my arms stand up. On the hood of my dark blue pickup, there were 4 long, parallel scratches. They started near the windshield and ran all the way to the grille. They weren't deep enough to show the bare metal, but they had gouged through the clear coat and the paint, leaving 4 pale, ugly scars. They were spaced perfectly, the width of a very large hand. It looked as if something had braced itself on my truck, or perhaps had simply tested the resilience of the metal with its claws. A calling card, a final reminder. I walked over and ran my fingers over the rough edges of the gouges. I leaned in, acting on a primal instinct, and sniffed the area. The scent was faint, almost gone, but it was there. The sour, human-like sweat and the faintest, sweetest whisper of old iron. Ernesto came and stood beside me. He looked at the scratches, and his face, which had been a mask of grim resolve, softened into something like recognition. He reached out and touched the longest scratch with the tip of his finger, then brought the finger to his nose. A strange expression crossed his features, a mix of disgust and something that looked like nostalgic familiarity. "In my country," he murmured, his voice low and distant, "when we are lucky enough to kill one, we must bury it. With salt, a lot of salt, in the mouth, in the wounds, so it does not return." I let out a short, harsh laugh that sounded more like a bark. "Well, here, we just fill out a police report." The words tasted like a lie. There would be no report. He gave me a small, sad smile and reached into the pocket of his thick wool coat. He fumbled for a moment and then pulled out his rosary. Clutched with it in his fist was a single coarse grain of what looked like rock salt. I have no idea where he got it. He held it out to me in his open palm. "For you," he said. I looked at the small crystalline rock. A week ago I would have laughed in his face. Now I felt an inexplicable urge to take it. I accepted it, my fingers brushing his calloused palm. It was an admission of defeat, a concession to a world whose rules I did not understand. It was a shared secret, a tiny artifact from a place I never wanted to visit again. We drove back to town in silence. We parted ways at the same diner where we'd met a lifetime ago. We shook hands. "Be careful, guide," he said, his dark eyes holding mine for a long moment. Then he turned and walked away, a solitary, burdened man heading back to a world where monsters were real. In the weeks that followed, I tried to forget. I scrubbed my hands raw, but I could still smell the phantom scent of pine and blood. I threw myself into my work, guiding loud, cheerful tourists on easy, well-marked trails, pointing out deer and telling sanitized stories about the history of the woods. I tried to bury the memory under a mountain of mundane reality. But at night, in the quiet of my cabin, it would return, the sound of a nail scraping on nylon, the impossible orange of that single luminous eye, the cold, empty space in the snow. 2 weeks later, I broke. I had to know. I drove back to the remote trailhead alone this time. The timocea of a guide, the stubborn need to see a thing through to its end, was a powerful force. The weather had changed. A fresh layer of snow had fallen, and the wind had swept the valley clean. The landscape was different, softer, its sharp edges blurred. I found the clearing. It took me a while. My red flagging tape was gone. The branch where my flashlight had been was bare, but the tree, the old fir, was still there. And on its trunk, faded and graying as the raw wood oxidized, was the X I had carved. It looked like an old forgotten scar. I walked to the spot. The snow was smooth and unbroken. There was no hollow, no sign that anything had ever happened there. It was just another anonymous patch of forest floor. I put my bare hand against the trunk of the tree, over the X. The bark was rough and intensely cold. The chill seeped into my fingers, my hand, my arm, a cold that felt ancient and deep. I stood there for a long time, just feeling the cold. In my pocket, my fingers found the single grain of salt Ernesto had given me. Without thinking, without any conscious decision, I took it out and tossed it onto the snow at the base of the tree. I felt a hot flush of shame. Not shame for the superstition, but for the need for it, for the quiet acknowledgement that my rifle, my maps, my entire rational world had failed. There are no werewolves, I say to myself sometimes, out loud, when the night is too quiet and the woods outside my window seem too dark. But I know there are things in this world that do not leave a corpse. I know from the weight of the silence in that valley, and the way the snow had opened up to reclaim its own, that not everything that falls to the ground stays there. Some things are called home by the places they came from, leaving no trail, as if the forest has a secret pocket where it gathers its lost children when men like me try to give them names and numbers. And maybe that's the only real comfort I've found. If there's no body, there's no proof. If there's no proof, then there's no explanation terrible enough to make me sound as crazy as I feel. All that's left is to respect the distances, to listen to the silences, and to tell any new clients that due to access issues, we no longer guide in that southern valley. It's not a lie. The truth is, for some places, the word access was never meant to apply. There's only a door, one we sometimes open without knowing, and it always shuts again before we can count how many fingers were on the hand that scarred the walls of our tent. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into the dark woods of Montana. If this story sent a shiver down your spine, please consider helping our channel grow. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next narrative. Most importantly, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below and let me know what you thought of the story. Did you feel the cold? Did you hear the howl? And tell me, from what city or country are you watching tonight? It's incredible to see how far these stories travel. Stay safe out there, and always be careful which trails you choose to follow. Use arrow up and arrow down to select a turn, enter to jump to it, and escape to return to the chat.